In the 1950s. You find it in the last chapter of The Great Transformation, but you will find it also in some writings of my father in the 50s. I remind you, he died in 1964. And in the 1950s, he became increasingly concerned. He was living in the United States, teaching at Columbia at that time, commuting between New York and Canada, where he made his home. Increasingly concerned with the trend towards uniformity, conformity, what he called averagism, and the tendency for people to be afraid to dissent from prevailing opinion. This is United States 1950s, and suggested that a highly advanced technological society had within it the dangers of a kind of totalitarianism. And I may say that he wrote all this before the role of the media had become so evident. The corporate control, before the corporate control of the media had become so powerful, and certainly before we saw anything like what was witnessed after 9/11 in the United States, which was a fear of nonconformity bordering on paranoia. So he felt, because going back to the fact that the idea of freedom was always very important to Karl Polanyi, that the right of nonconformity, that would have to, every society would have to have an institutionalized mechanism to protect nonconformity. He saw this as one of the benefits coming from the English accent on liberty, as distinct from the continental European accent on equality, back to the French Revolution, of course. Well, but this liberty in England was available only to select members of people benefiting from the rentier incomes of the late 19th or early 20th century, incidentally, much of which came simply from the vast foreign investments that Britain had at that time. That was the Belle Époque in England, in France, in Vienna, in Europe, etc. And it produced many great minds, but it was the result of privilege of certain sections of the population. And what my father believed was that kind of creative intellectual activity that had to be protected, but for all the people, not only for the privileged. It was all right with Aristotle, but they depended on slaves. And then the Belle Époque of the late 19th century really and truly was a class-ridden society of which my father's family were beneficiaries, and he was very aware of that. But his idea was then that this freedom and this creativity that would be permitted by the absence of economic pressures would have to be based on, the ultimate base of it would be, in his view, a popular culture. Now, which I don't mean a pop culture, but I mean what was intended there was the collective wisdom, knowledge, tradition, and sense of ordinary people in every country, whatever, but in different societies. And he said, well, this kind of democracy would be different in Europe, North America, Russia, India, China. These are countries he mentioned in the 1950s, but it would be rooted in the collective pool of popular culture. This is developed in an essay called Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Is Freedom Possible? It's a very fascinating essay that deals with the classical questions of liberty and equality, and attempts to find and suggest a solution which he attributes to Rousseau, which is based on this idea of the popular culture. So I leave you with this, my assignment, to try to research what Polanyi had to say. But this would be an important reason, because if there is some subsistence of an income, it is possible for people who are dissident in a society to survive, to organize, to create, to live as musicians and as artists, as well as be a base for people who wish to advance economically. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I can go a little bit longer. Oh, thank you so much. I then wanted to do what I referred to earlier, which is to carry this story forward to our times. Now, the Great Transformation was written. First of all, the transformation he spoke about was that from the 19th century liberal order, which collapsed in 1914, which they tried to resurrect after the war unsuccessfully with the gold standard and the League of Nations and all of that, but eventuated in fascisms pretty well throughout Central and East Europe. Italy, Austria, Germany, and a whole number of Poland and a number of other East European countries. And there he took a position which was expressed many times in a number of writings, and I'm going to sum it up in a moment, but I think what is interesting is to consider whether this continues to be true today. Basically, he said that the interest of the economy, by which it was clear he meant the industrialists of the free enterprise capitalist economy, and the interests of the people, which he called democracy, are basically at variance one with the other. And he said that during the period in Europe, there were conflicts of a kind which really brought the political process to a standstill of opposition between parliaments representing socialist and left-wing parties and industrialists, and that this conflict, when resolved in favor of the industrialists, was fascism. And if it could be resolved in favor, so to speak, of democracy, of the parliament, to the degree that this would include also the economic, not only political, but economic democracy, that would be socialism. And that's pretty well, and that is repeated over and over. Perhaps it is somewhat simplistic, but I'm telling you that that is how it appeared, certainly in the 1930s in Europe. Now, when my father wrote The Great Transformation, and it was finished in 1943. It's important to remember that date, because that book was finished pretty well when it was clear that Nazism and Germany